Thanks for joining us at the special edition of CBN News Showcase. I'm Ephraim Graham. For the last year, the Me Too movement has rocked the government, business, and entertainment worlds with widespread reports of abuse. But for many, the most shocking reports have come from within the church. CBN's Heather Sells has spent months following this disturbing trend and joins us now with this eye-opening report.
Yeah, Ephraim, the casualties in the church are many, and there seems to be no community that has not been impacted. While some church leaders have questioned whether Me Too has gone too far, it has helped assault victims to begin to open up, tell their stories, and force, in some cases, faith leaders to admit their guilt. Many are now asking just how safe is the church?
Wheaton College, a top evangelical school, moved to address that question by hosting a historic Me Too summit in December. Many speakers shared their stories of abuse, some for the first time. Bible study teacher and child abuse survivor Beth Moore kicked off the event, noting the reaction to a report on widespread abuse in independent fundamental Baptist churches.
The question comes to us again, shall the church stand idly by? I've been told by a number of fellow Christians, I just don't read articles like that, Beth.
Moore told me the church must prepare to hear these stories and respond with compassion.
One of the things that I really want to push back on is this thing that says, I just can't stand to hear about it. Listen, if people can go through this, we can listen to their stories.
Wheaton's Ed Stetzer told CBN evangelicals must realize the responsibility of caring for victims and protecting children in their midst.
This has been an issue in our churches. It's not just the Catholics, it's not just fundamentalists. They've all been in the news lately. It's also evangelical churches, and we got to address some cultural issues within the church.
So how are churches responding to reports of abuse? In a recent Lifeway survey, 2/3 of pastors said they're aware of sexual or domestic violence in their church, but half of them said they weren't prepared to deal with it. That's how Pastor Jimmy Hinton felt. In 2011, he received the shock of his life when a member of his congregation told him that his dad, the former pastor of their church, had abused her. So Heather, that victim and member of the congregation recently decided to share her story with CBN. Why?
Yeah, we were really honored, and she said that she shared her story because she wants to encourage others to come forward with their stories. In her case, it meant putting everything on the line, reporting John Hinton, who was widely respected as a man of God and loving husband and father. I traveled to Somerset, Pennsylvania, where Hinton's former congregation has spent the last 8 years recovering from this fact. Their pastor had a very, very dark side, and for years, no one, not even his family, suspected that he was assaulting the very children he professed to love.
Clara and John Hinton married in 1970 at the small Christian college where they met. He would complete a Bible degree, serve as a youth pastor, and 2 years later, they moved to this small Pennsylvania town. She saw it as the start of their dream ministry and never imagined the evil that would rip through her family, destroy her marriage, and shake her to the core.
We were kids when we moved to Somerset, Pennsylvania. We were 22 years old. I had prayed from a young child up for a Christian husband. That's all I ever wanted, was a Christian husband, and I wanted to be a Christian wife and mother.
And that was their life. Dedicated to the Lord, John became pastor of the Church of Christ, and they went on to have a large family, 11 children.
He was very relaxed and very calm, very kind. He was great with the kids. He was their go-to person. He was my spiritual leader. We would spend many hours talking about God and our faith.
She and many others considered John to be a super dad, never missing a game or concert.
He played with them. He hung out with them. He was that person. In fact, I had women in the church would often tell me, I wish my husband was like yours.
Their fifth son, Jimmy, adored his dad.
He was always outside playing with us. He never just ignored us and pushed us off.
As he grew older, Jimmy began to appreciate his father's ministry and dreamed of following his footsteps.
I remember sitting in the pews here and hearing him preach and hearing the passion behind it, and he just knew his Bible really well. And I just remember thinking, I want to be standing up there one day. I want to be making a difference in the world one day.
Both dreams would come true, but not in the way Jimmy had hoped. Even as Clara and Jimmy perceived an ideal family, John Hinton kept a double life hidden that neither ever suspected.
During those years of marriage, did you ever stop and go, something's not right, I wonder if he's abusing kids?
I stopped and said something's not right, but never once did I ever think he's abusing kids.
None of us ever suspected that he was abusing anybody in any capacity, let alone the worst kind of abuse that you could imagine.
Clara did struggle to understand some of his behavior.
He would just do off-the-wall things. For instance, he would be preaching and do really weird things. He threw a lit firecracker in the auditorium one morning, and it's like, why do you do this stuff?
Another time, one of their daughters found him locked in his office looking at pornography.
When I asked him what in the world that was about, he said, oh, I was just researching for sermons. He said, I'm going to do a series of sermons on porn. And he said, how can you teach on porn if you don't know what it's about? So he said, I was preparing sermon topics. And I believed him.
The master pedophile seemed to always have an answer for anyone who asked about any strange behavior. But one of his victims was growing up and would come to realize not only had Hinton abused her, he was likely still abusing others.
So Heather, it is amazing no one knew.
Right, it's one of the tactics that abusers use. It's called grooming, and they use it to basically shut down questioning. People learn not to ask them questions, and that's what he did in this case, and it really emboldened him.
Wow. So for the woman who actually came forward to call out John Hinton, what led her to do so?
He actually asked her to babysit. This is something that he did in his later years, and watching him interact with these young children forced her to confront her own abuse and recognize that he was still preying on kids.
The victim who would turn the tables on John Hinton was actually his youngest child, Alex. She started having flashbacks as a young adult.
I saw this picture of my dad touching me in an inappropriate way, but it was one of those things that I would try to play it off like, oh, he wouldn't actually do that to me. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe I'm not remembering something correctly. Or, yeah, I just kept trying to brush it off.
But when he asked her to help him babysit 4 little girls, something felt wrong.
One of the kids had said that she loved spending the night at his house. And she had asked him that day, are we spending the night at your house tonight, Mr. John? And can we sleep in your bed?
Alex began to research what are the signs of a child sex offender and what are the signs of abuse in a child. The answers hit hard. Her dad matched the profile of an abuser and Alex fit the profile of a victim.
I thought I was just this really babyish kid who was super dependent on my mom until I was 10 years old, afraid to go to bed and having severe separation anxiety from her and all this stuff. No, it all started to make sense and just click.
In the weeks that followed, Alex wrestled with her decision. She knew that if she told, everything would change. After making her choice, she first went to her mom.
Her body was shaking, she was trembling, she was hysterical. And at that moment, it was like a million light bulbs went off because so many little fragments of things that happened all along the years.
It became clear that they must tell Jimmy, son, brother, and current pastor of the church after John had left. Although terrified, Alex decided she could trust her brother, who had been her buddy for years, She made an appointment to meet him in his office.
It just takes the breath away from you. And I looked up and she was crying and I started to cry. And I said, you know, I honestly don't know what this looks like. She had no reason to make that up. There was absolutely nothing to gain by making that up. That level of an accusation. I said, I believe you. And I think she needed to hear that. And the way I describe it is, I really think that was the Holy Spirit putting those words on my lips in that moment. Because I really think she had to hear that.
That very weekend, Jimmy had to officiate a church wedding with his father present. He found it excruciating to keep this news secret. But the next decision, whether to report John to authorities, came much easier.
You had so much to lose by reporting.
Yes, I had everything to lose.
So why was that a snap decision for you?
Because I had to know. I had to know the truth. And reporting it and having it investigated by professionals was the only way that we were going to find out the truth.
Both he and his mother also knew the consequences would be devastating.
How will I live? How will I take care of the children? How can financially, how will we keep our home? Where will we go?
Authorities found more than enough to convict John Hinton. After 40 years in Somerset, police charged him with 200 counts, including rape of a child, indecent assault of a child, designing obscene materials, and possession of child pornography. In June of 2012, a judge sentenced the 62-year-old to a minimum of 30 years behind bars.
Heather, it sounds like there's no doubt that he had abused children.
Yes, investigators told me that they found photos and other physical evidence that moved this case well beyond a he said, she said situation.
Were any of the victims his victims at Jimmy's church?
Yes, they were. Surprisingly, though, both Jimmy and Clara found in the aftermath that there was public support for John Hinton. And this is common in churches where abusers are well-known and respected leaders.
John Hinton's time as pastor of the Church of Christ left members with positive memories. He had led many to Christ, baptized, and married them. Even after his arrest, there was still compassion for Hinton.
When he got arrested, they would ask me, you know, how's your dad doing? How's your dad doing? And at first I would answer it and I would be polite. But then after a while, I just thought, not one person has asked how my dad's victims are doing. And so I started to answer people. I'd say, well, he's doing fine. It's his victims who aren't doing well.
Clara had hoped for personal support and felt crushed when it didn't come.
You think people are going to run up to you and hug you and embrace you and say, let me pray with you and how can I help you? And that didn't happen. So it's been a lonely road.
Alex has traveled a road that's not uncommon for abuse victims of spiritual leaders. She stopped attending church and has no desire to go back.
I don't like the idea of God as a fatherly being. Clearly, you know, if that's who he is, he wasn't there for me. If my dad was supposed to be someone who was spreading his word, that's not the case at all.
As Jimmy Hinton has said, the devil got inside our family and none of us saw it. But today, Hinton, his mother, and his sister are seen much more clearly. And they want other families and churches to know that sometimes someone close to you is an abuser.
He confessed to 23 victims, and we think he has into the hundreds. And so it's a really humbling thing to say, I didn't have a clue. So my question was, how did we miss it?
Heather, since the hashtag #MeToo movement began, there's a growing number of churches that want to make sure that they don't miss it. What can you tell us about those efforts?
Right. Well, it's interesting. Jimmy Hinton has become one of the leading advocates in understanding how abusers work in church cultures. And we are learning that churches, unfortunately, are often safe places for predators. Churches are working with several organizations to proactively learn how to prevent abuse and create safe environments for those who want to tell their story.
There are those in the Somerset Church of Christ who know all too well the rooms where their trusted pastor abused the innocent. It's why the elders have moved to intentionally protect kids. Today, Empty classrooms are locked. Adults work in teams of 2 or more with kids. On Sundays, monitors do random building sweeps, and each classroom has a walkie-talkie in case of an emergency. Church policy also protects children from potentially unwanted physical touch.
None of us can walk up to a kid, pull a kid in, and initiate that physical contact. And I think that's really important because abusers very subtly initiate physical contact, and that's how they begin what people call the grooming process.
For registered sex offenders, the church will provide a separate service to avoid contact with kids and alert the congregation to their presence. Elder Bob Martin acknowledges that while possibly controversial, it's a matter of safety first.
When someone is aware of that in their congregation and fails to notify them, I think they got to answer to God for that. And I don't want to stand before him and explain why I did not protect one of his children.
As Me Too has prompted a national conversation about abuse, the Church Too movement has shined a light, sparking the realization that not only are churches often uninformed, they can actually provide safe havens for abusers. Nancy Beach would know. The church consultant is a former pastor at Willow Creek, a megachurch in Chicago. Her accusations of sexual misconduct against senior pastor Bill Hybels, along with others, led to his resignation, but only after years and numerous calls for an impartial investigation.
We have a tendency to sort of put our pastors and sometimes worship leaders and others who are up front on kind of a pedestal, treating them like celebrities. And there's a danger in that I think we're all learning.
Boz Chividjian founded the nonprofit organization Grace to advise ministries and churches about abuse. He says when a leader is the abuser, the dynamic of power must be considered.
I hear oftentimes people talking about, well, this pastor had an affair with a woman in his congregation. Well, that's not an affair. It's an abuse of power because the pastor has a greater sense of both spiritual authority in the church, but also a greater degree of power over that individual. And we don't think about it in that way.
Many churches, says Chividjian, are quick to apply grace to abusers and the law to victims, asking them to forgive and move on. It's a pattern made easy by leaders that already enjoy widespread support.
So what you'll often see is an abuser responding to an allegation in a way that spins a narrative that they're the actual victim. And then what ends up happening over the time period is the people around them, the people that are naturally would gravitate towards wanting to support them anyway, buy into that narrative. And now the abuser is the victim. The victim now is seen as sort of the perpetrator, the one causing the problems.
Wheaton College professor Ed Stetzer says churches should give a greater voice to abuse survivors as they look to make their churches safe. Another key, making sure pastors are accountable to other leaders.
I think a healthy evangelicalism is an evangelicalism that recognizes that we need to hold one another accountable, that no one is above being questioned, that ultimately we listen to those and believe those who come to us hurting and struggling.
Chividjian says churches will be best prepared to prevent abuse and respond to it if they've taken the time to create a policy. Creating a plan gives the congregation a guide to know what to report and who to report it to. It helps leaders respond compassionately and consistently.
At the end of the day, if the church rolls up their sleeves and decides to develop their own policies using resources and the expertise of others, there's a much greater likelihood that that policy will become part of the living DNA of that church, because they'll know what's in the policy, they'll know why what's in the policy is there, and they take ownership of it.
Abused children face tremendous suffering, often for a lifetime. They're at a greater risk of emotional and physical problems. The struggle to understand God becomes especially difficult if their abuser held spiritual authority over them. Today, Alex Hinton hopes that the Me Too movement will continue to encourage more survivors to come forward, and she wants people to look out for predators right in their midst.
I think people still have this image in their minds of the creepy pedophile in the white van with no windows or tinted out windows, watching kids at the playground and handing out candy. Like, no, that's not who you're watching out for. You're watching out for your preschool teacher, like your daycare leader, your preacher, your swim coach, whoever it is, like someone who's close to the kids and involved in their daily life.
Today, both Clara and Jimmy Hinton hope they can help survivors. They co-host a podcast and have openly shared their challenges. For Jimmy, part of the healing has come in his journey to understand abusers. He's learned from correspondence with his dad in prison. One question and answer still haunts him.
I had written him a question and I said, was there anything that surprised you over all these decades of abusing all of these victims? And he wrote me back and he said, there's one thing that surprised me. And he said, that's how naive adults are. And he said, you can literally do anything, even right in front of adults, and they're completely clueless.
Both have spent time with some of Hinton's victims and regret that they did not understand that at times he was grooming and even abusing them in plain sight. Part of that process was his oddball behavior, which Clara and Jimmy say paved the way for his abuse.
Pedophiles will test the waters to see how far they can go with a person, or in this case, a group of people. What can they do that's totally off the wall and still have the command of the group, still have the reverence of the group, the support of the group? And John did multiple things to test people all of the time. Now I understand that.
Still, she says, it's stunning to think that the man she married, the man so respected by their church, had them all fooled.
What's interesting in a sad, sad way is he preached about such things, about being harmful to children, and he was this great dad. It was like he's two people. He was this wonderful, loving, kind man, and he was one of the most evil, vile men that ever was.
So Heather, what do we know about John Hinton today?
He is expected to remain behind bars for the rest of his life, and I talked with a detective in this case, some other family members. No one says that he has shared any remorse with them whatsoever.
That's so painful to hear. For someone who would like to take action, what can people do?
I talked with Boz Javidjian about this, who we just saw in the last story, and he said, go to your pastor and ask to see your church's child protection policy. If there's not one, help them create it. My takeaway from all of this is be that safe person for other people. For Alex, the safe person was her mom and her brother. Her brother had cooked her dinner over the years, repaired her car, and so in the end, she felt safe with both of them, and that really made all the difference in this case.
Important. Heather, thank you so much for your in-depth reporting on this very important issue.
You're welcome.